Hello students, welcome to this lesson. In this lesson, we are going to study alcohol production that include production of beer, wine and sprites. Alcohol production is a biochemical or fermentation process where sugars are converted to alcohol and carbon dioxide by using microorganisms, usually yeast cells. This alcoholic production passes through a certain stepwise processes. The first step here is ingredient selection. In this ingredient selection, sugar-containing foodstuff and yeast cells are the main ingredients that are required in this first step. The second step here is preparation or mashing. That means milling. Grains are usually milled or ground to break down the structure and making sugars easier to access. Mashing is the process in which grains or other ingredients are combined with hot water to release and convert complex carbohydrates into fermentable sugars. The third step here is fermentation. This fermentation is a process in which mash is transferred to fermentation vessels where yeast is added. The yeast then converts the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide over several days or weeks, depending on the types of beverage what we are going to produce. The fourth step is distillation. Mostly this distillation technique works for Sprite alcohols. This distillation mostly works for beverages like whiskey, vodka, rum, and gin. The fermented liquid is here distilled to concentrate the alcohol. Distillation heats the liquid to evaporate the alcohol, which is then condensed back into more concentrated forms. The fifth step is aging. Some alcoholic beverages like whiskey, wine, and certain rums are aged in barrels. Aging can add more complex flavors. The last step here is bottling and packaging. After reaching the desired alcohol content, the beverage is filtered and packaged in bottles, cans, and barrels for distribution. Okay, let's shift to beer production. Beer production or brewing is a multi-step process that transforms grains, usually barley, into beer through fermentation. That means beer is produced through fermenting sugary juices by using a fermentation agent, yeast cells or Saccharomyces. Fermentation process in beer production include malting cereal grains, usually barley. This malting process is so fundamental to increase the concentration of starch digesting enzymes. Second, these malted grains must be crushed and mixed with hot water, which produces mash. After a few hours, a liquid extract called wort must be separated from the mixture. Hops, mostly the flower cones of hop plants, must be cut off and added to the wort for flavoring. Fifth, the mixture must be boiled to stop the enzyme action and precipitate the proteins. And lastly, we need to add a strain of Saccharomyces. Then we have to let the fermentation to begin. During fermentation, yeast converts the sugars in the wort into alcohol, mostly ethanol alcohol and carbon dioxide. This process typically takes about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the type of beer and fermentation temperature. And the fermentation can also produce other substances like amyl alcohol, isoamyl alcohol, acetic acid, and butyric acid, which adds flavor of the beer. After fermentation, what must we do is remove the yeast cell, and the beer must be filtered, pasteurized, and bottled. This is the photograph that exhibits where beer production is performed. The second forms of alcohol production is wine production. Wine production or wine making is a process of transforming grapes or other fruits into wine through fermentation. That means wine is made from juice extracted from grapes, any fruit, and even from nuts and dandelion blossoms. So in wine production, what must we do is first we need to harvest grapes. Grapes are harvested when they reach optimal ripeness because timing here is so crucial since the sugar levels, acidity, and flavor profile of the grapes will determine the wine's characteristics. Then, after harvesting, we need to select matured grapes and crush them to release the required amount of juice. Here, the juice should be treated with sulfur dioxide to kill any wild yeasts that may already be present. Sugar and strain of Saccharomyces are then added, and the fermentation process can proceed. In the fermentation process, yeast begins to convert the sugars in the grape juice into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And this fermentation process lasts from a few days to several weeks. Like beer, although ethyl alcohol is the main product of fermentation, there is also other products similar to the beer like amyl alcohol, isoamyl alcohol, acetic acid, and butyric acid, which add flavor to the wine. So in both beer and wine, the particular characteristic of the juice and the yeast strain determines the flavors of the final product. When fermentation is completed in wine production, liquid wine is siphoned to separate it from the yeast sediments. If necessary, suspended materials can be cleaned by using agents like charcoal. And lastly, we need to bottle and age the wine in a cool place before distribution to customers or users. This is the image of factory where wine gets produced. The third form of alcoholic production is spirits production. The production of spirits or distilled alcoholic beverages involves fermenting ingredients like grains, fruits, and sugar canes to produce alcohol, which then be distilled to increase the alcohol content and concentration of flavors. That means spirits or the strongest alcohols are made from fermentation of a variety of foods, including malted barley, rye, corn, wine or fruit juice, potatoes, and molasses. That means we can produce a Scotch whiskey from malted barley, rye whiskey or gin from rye, bourbon or corn whiskey from corn, brandy from wine or fruit juice, vodka from potatoes, and rum from molasses. So this indicates that selecting or choosing and preparing raw materials or the base ingredient affects the sprite's flavor. So we need to choose the right materials or the right ingredients to prepare the required types of Sprite alcohol. Then mashing here is very important. When we use grains must be crushed and mixed with hot water. This process, as we know from beer production, is mashing. Enzymes in the grain convert starches into fermentable sugars. Here, after mashing, we can acquire the liquid which is rich in sugar is known as wort. Then we need to add yeast cells into the wort and let the occurrence of fermentation. That means yeast here is added to the wort or juice in the case of fruits to convert sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The fermentation typically takes a few days depending on the type of Sprite and desired alcohol content we need to acquire. Then we need to distill the fermented contents. That means the fermented liquid is heated to separate alcohol from water and non-volatile components. As we know, alcohol vaporizes at a low temperature than water and then collected as it condenses. So distillation is often performed multiple times to achieve the desired purity and alcohol concentration. Because of distillation, the alcohol content of sprites range from 40 to 50%, much higher than the typical 12% of wine and 6% of beer. Then lastly, we have to age, filter, and bottle the products to increase the flavor. This is Sprite producing factory looks like.